I'm ready.
Let's do it. All right. How's it going, everybody? Welcome to Afterlife Apologetics with both myself and Dr. Steve Miller, my good friend and mentor, as usual. He'll join us. And for those of you who were not here, we're going to jump right in, catching you up real fast, which is we are in the Glove series, which is my framework for evaluating near-death experiences and comparing them across different worldviews to see which worldview most properly explains them. And Steve has been awesome. I was reviewing some aspects of the episode last week, and Steve, you did a great job of kind of
Thank
engaging
you.
with me. And I'm looking forward to more and maybe even a little more discourse. Who knows? But today we are going to jump in on the G. So we have GLOVE. Today's episode will be on the G. And one quick announcement, guys, is next week we won't be live because Steve is out of town, but we will be live the week after. So you guys can take a break, maybe review some of the material that we go over today. And then if you have any comments, questions, concerns, disagreements, as always, we love and welcome those. So please post them below of anything that you think is not accurate, because we will eventually do a series where we engage with any of the comments that come in on these videos. And yeah, go from there. Anything you want to address, Steve, before we begin to address G?
No, just for people who weren't in for last week or are finding this randomly on the web. So this is an acrostic that helps us pull together the many aspects of near-death experiences. GLOVE, and we're going to start with the G. But these are core parts of the experience that are helpful in comparing it between worldviews, between religious beliefs, to see which seem to fit like a glove, onto the hand of the experience. Did I put that right?
Yeah, correct. That is correct. Okay, and so you guys will see me kind of looking back and forth here. I'm obviously reading off from my notes to the left here, so if you guys are wondering what I'm looking over at, that's what I'm looking at. So I'm going to read from my notes. We're beginning in on G. And what we're going to do is I'll first explain what G is. I'll use some of the characteristics. Describe some of the characteristics that are associated with G. And then from there, we'll proceed on to evaluating different worldviews and their explanatory power for the finger of G. Okay? Does that make sense, Steve?
Yes, let's go for it.
Awesome. All right. So G stands for God-focused. Quick context, God-focused is a very common attribute associated with near-death experiences as well as deathbed experiences. And so what is it? A distinctive feature that consistently surfaces is the encounter with a divine, loving entity typically identified as God. Not always, but typically. These profound experiences invariably portray a unique depiction of the divine characterized by the following key attributes. And the way I arrived at these key attributes was to essentially look at a breadth of descriptions of the divine being and then start to kind of rank them out in terms of what was most commonly used to describe this divine being. Okay. So if you're like, oh, well, they have used this word, it's again, I'm not looking for outliers. I'm looking at the data set and going for characteristics that are most commonly used. Really quick to illustrate this, again, to go back to the court case, it would be like people talk about seeing someone at the crime scene. All right. I'm focusing on which parts of them are repeated most often amongst the witnesses to consider that the most reliable. So if a lot of the witnesses say if a lot of the witnesses say that the suspect they saw was 6'5", I'm going to take that into consideration versus one witness saying he had a blue shirt on. I'll be like, okay, maybe he had a blue shirt, maybe he didn't, but I can feel a lot more safe saying he was 6'5" because of how often it was mentioned in the witness accounts. And so it's the same thing here when I'm discussing what attributes people associate with this divine being.
Another way to put it is we're getting back to the core experience.
Yeah.
What are the core elements that we see repeated over and over, rather than taking anonymous elements and trying to pull them together to prove some niche viewpoint?
Correct. Okay, number one, unconditional love. Central to the divine encounters in near-death experiences is the portrayal of God as a being of infinite love. This love is often described as overwhelming and beyond human comprehension. Notably, this aligns with the Christian understanding of God as unconditional love. And the passage I've noted here is 1 John 4:8, where it says specifically that God is love. Okay. Not to say that it's an impersonal love, but it's to say that God and love are so synonymous with one another. It's sufficient to say God is love. Does that make sense what I just said, Steve, or do you feel like I kind of didn't walk that nuance?
Yes, and there are other passages that talk about just the incredible nature of God's love. Yes, so I mean, there are a lot of religions that will say that God will do something loving things, but it's like to say that God is love in his very essence.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty powerful statement.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And one thing I want to make as a quick note before we move on from this is how what I would refer to as kind of the philosophy of love. Okay. And so when I think about this, I think of love as requiring both a giver and a receiver. And love, if there's an unconditional love, it means that the giver of the love is not placing conditions by which to give you that love. Now, you're like, Charlie, why is this relevant? Here's why it's relevant. Is a worldview would need to have God as a personal being in order to properly explain God's ability to love. Does that make sense, Steve?
True, the Force in Star Wars does not love.
Right.
It's an impersonal force that can be used by good or for evil. You're talking about something that's personal because an impersonal force does not love.
Yeah. And unconditional is also a notable aspect in that a being has to make a choice of not having conditions associated with their love. So love has to be felt and given by a personal being, is essentially what I'm saying here. So if the worldview that you have doesn't account for a personal, loving God, then based off of this evidence, it will not properly account for reality as a whole. And that's how
Very
far
good.
I'll take. Okay. So the next aspect is omniscient. NDE experiencers often describe the divine figure as a source of profound wisdom and knowledge. It's as if during their brief encounter, they were offered a glance into the divine wisdom that governs life and the universe, paralleling the Christian conception of God as the ultimate source of truth. You guys will notice that I'm constantly drawing parallels to Christian ideas, and that's all well and good. I put my cards on the table and said, look, I believe this framework absolutely points to Christianity. So I just want you to know that's why I'm adding these in there. And specifically, I'm referencing Colossians 2:3, referencing God's omniscience and his all-knowing wisdom and power. Again, these are character attributes of God that the worldview needs to properly account for or note or have some explanation for. I wouldn't even say they have to specifically note the characteristic of God, but they need to have room for it at least. And so what this does is it knocks things like deism, for example, off the table, because a deistic God is not necessarily an omniscient God.
I think I would back up and say, I think the near-death experience, core experience, points to omniscience. I don't know how many of them say, "Ooh, I saw the being of light and he was omniscient." What they'll say are things that point to omniscience, such as, "He knew everything
About
about
me,
me,"
sure.
or, "I got to the other side." You know how in 1 Corinthians 13 it talks about that, uh at the end of time, I'll when we're before God, we'll see all things clearly as He sees them now. A lot of people say, "Oh, I was on the other side and I could see,
Clearly. Yeah.
understood the problem of evil, this and this." So their minds were opened up, and this being seemed to know everything about them. Well, that points toward omniscience. That seems to be consistent with an omniscient God.
Yeah, and there's also descriptions, Steve, where they'll say things like, "It seemed like all the questions I ever had were answered. It seemed like
Yes,
everything I
yes.
had questions about, there were answers to." So again, yeah, you're right in terms of it being that nuance. It definitely points to the being omniscient, seeing as this being has answers to all the questions that people have.
And it's consistent with omniscience.
There you go. There you go. Okay, so consistent with omniscience. All right. All right, non-judgmental. Remarkably, many NDEers describe undergoing a life review in the presence of this divine being, not for the purpose of judgment or condemnation, I know, Steve, we're going to have some nuances here that we need to discuss on that, and that's fine.
Sure.
But rather for gaining understanding and insight, I'll kind of explain this concept here in a moment. This concept echoes the Christian notion of God's grace and mercy found in things like Ephesians 2:8 and personal, unlike impersonal or distant, or excuse me, I was already jumping ahead. I was going to personal. Okay, so non-judgmental. Now, I understand that in a previous podcast we've kind of discussed the nuances of non-judgmental. So allow me to kind of illustrate what I mean here, and maybe I'll end up changing this word. But basically, God is able to see the actions that we've done in life, and in a sense, He is almost trying to inform us as to how, if we had lived properly, how much better of an outcome that would have been, not only for ourselves, but for everyone around us. And so in that sense, he's non-judgmental. And the way that they'll describe it, I guess, is the best way to kind of make sense of it, which is God will essentially say, like, oh, we could have done better there, couldn't we? And kind of almost like cheering us on doing the right thing as opposed to doing the wrong thing, and God being like, what a terrible thing that you did there. So it is judgmental, but it's not judgmental. I mean, it's judgmental in the sense, like in a modern day context, I think judgmental would be this idea that someone disagrees with something that you're doing, and so therefore God is being judgmental because he is disagreeing with the decision fundamentally by saying you could have done a better thing there. But I think it's non-judgmental in the sense that God comes at it from the nature of understanding how, as a human being, you could lead yourself to thinking that was a good thing to do, even though it was a bad thing to do. And so God has grace with us because he understands that we're flawed and frankly stupid sometimes, and we make bad decisions because we have bad information. And so in that sense, God is non-judgmental. So I don't know, Steve, maybe you can help me find a better word, but that's kind of what I mean when I say that this character is non-judgmental.
Perhaps we could say the being of light, which seems to be God, I'll talk about that in a minute, is it, it it is helping us make judgments on our lifestyle and what we've done in the past, but he's not being judgmental about it, typically in the sense of condemning us.
Mm,
I mean, generally, when we think of judgmental, we think of somebody with a condemning, looking down on us with a frown on the
sure.
face and saying, "Oh, what did you do?" Now, there are certain, maybe a good many, where somebody feels like that the angels or God were just, they felt the disappointment in the way
Mm-hmm.
they had treated people and done things. And so there is the sense of that judgmental or making a judgment on it. But I think typically it's like people are so made aware of not only what they've done to somebody else, but how that person felt
Well, from that,
during
yeah.
that time when you were doing that, that, oh my goodness, they just realize the horror of what we've done. And so people who come to this and say, "Oh, well, in a near-death experience, I found out it doesn't really matter what you've done
Yeah.
because it's just all about growth in your life. So this thing about sin really isn't there." And I'm saying, "Oh my goodness, of course it is. That's one of the biggest things people see, especially if they've had a life review, is they realize the horror of what they've done to other people with their words and their actions, and they want to repent. They want to change. They want to do better." Because they do realize that that was sinful what they did. It was wrong. And the being of light was not wanting them to do that. He wanted them to learn to be loving.
Okay. All right. Personal. Unlike impersonal or distant representations of the divine in some religions, the God figure of NDEs is often perceived as deeply personal and intimate.
Yes, and I think that's in the vast majority of near-death experiences. He is a personal being. And now some people from more of a new age worldview will say, "Oh, well, you went to the other side and you realize the connection of all things," and they think that implies lack of a personal God, that it's an impersonal God. But over and over in near death experiences, actually, you see that it is I who left my body. It's I who looked over my life. I was separate from the being of light, God. And so I think very much, overwhelmingly, when they meet the being of light, when they meet God, it's someone who's personal, and they'll even say has a personality, a sense of humor. He's loving. He has these qualities about him, and is personal. Very rare, I think, that we would see an impersonal being, someone saying that that's what they saw on the other side.
Yeah. And then that kind of feeds into the next and final point, which is transcendent yet immanent. The divine
Okay.
figure in NDEs is often described as a transcendent, otherworldly light or being, yet it is simultaneously intimate, involved, and present within the near death experiencer. This resonates with the Christian concept of a God who is both beyond and independent of the universe and active and present within the universe. And I think this is a really important one as well because like you just mentioned, Steve, there is this kind of new age, or it's kind of like new age is almost a blend of Eastern ideas with Western, specifically with Christianity. And so what I want to note here is how often we see God being his own figure, his own character in the story. He's not just this kind of like energy, like you mentioned, this impersonal force like in Star Wars. He's making decisions, he's having interactions, he's coming from a place where people understand that fundamentally this being is different from them, and that they have this
Yes.
almost like understanding of the nature of this being is different and higher than them, yet this being is still personal and making decisions to love them and have an unconditional love towards them, as if as almost like a creator loves a painting regardless of the painting, so much so that the creator's just like, that's my painting and I'm proud of that painting for what it is, even though other people may not appreciate the painting whatsoever. So
Yes, I would agree with you, and I think that it remains that I am still intact when I go to the other side. I am the one experiencing these
right,
things.
your identity
I
is
have
still
not
intact,
been
yeah.
I've not been dissolved into a cosmic mind where I no longer exist. I'm very much existing, and I'm talking to deceased people who are still themselves on the other
Mm-hmm.
side, a being of light who's separate from them, angels who are separate from them. They're individuals all through. That speaks to a transcendent and yet immanent God.
Yep, exactly. Okay, and so now what we'll do is, now that we've had these, okay, so again we'll review them here. Unconditional love, a knowledge consistent with omniscience. We'll say that. Huh?
Nice.
I still can't think of a clever way for non-judgmental. Maybe like ethically focused or something. I don't know. I'll have to kind of massage that one and find a good word to kind of.
Points out our sins, but is nice about it. Come
Sure.
up with a term that says
Yeah.
that.
Corrective, not condemning. How about that? Is that would that work? Corrective, not condemning. I don't know. I don't know.
We'll work on it. We'll
Yeah.
keep
Okay.
working on it.
Definitely personal though. Personal. And then finally, transcendent yet imminent. And again, transcendent yet imminent. When you're like thinking about that one, I want you to think of it in terms of different and apart from the universe that we're a part of, but still involved and actively puts themselves in it. So that's kind of how I want you to think about transcendent yet imminent. Okay, so now that we have all these characteristics, let's go about evaluating worldviews and kind of how they would jive with these characteristics of God. So once we enter the sphere of them, all these diverse worldviews, it becomes immediately apparent that not all descriptions of the divine align with this personal and loving God, so-called God, encountered in near-death experiences. It's within this context that we see a clear distinction between various worldviews and the evidence provided by NDEs, shedding light on unique harmony between near-death experiences and the Christian worldview. But let's kind of evaluate a few of them. Many deists, for instance, posit a God who, after creating the universe, remains distant and uninvolved. This impersonal deity starkly contrasts the intimate, involved God revealed in NDEs, whom experiencers describe as being deeply concerned with human affairs. The God of deism wouldn't concern himself with providing a transformative, loving experience to those near death, to those having the near death phenomenon that is commonly reported in near death experiences. Additionally, this God would probably also not have a deeply and intimate love or personal knowledge of us, I would say as well. I understand that's a little more on the fringes, but ultimately, the fundamental argument would be here that this deist God that some worldviews want to posit just does not align with the personal loving God that we do find in these experiences.
And I'll just say, you said it well at the beginning. You said some deists. I would say probably um, the people who today consider themselves deist think of a God who created the world and kind of went away, is no longer
Mm-hmm.
interacting personally with the world.
Yeah.
But at America's founding, there were several types of deists,
Hmm.
some of which were just traditional Christians who believed that there was evidence for their faith. They would have been the apologists of their time. So if you look in the history, there are various types of deists. Don't confuse them all, but I think you're speaking of today's deists, which typically are saying God is distant, God's done his own way, and this doesn't seem consistent with that type of God.
Right. Correct. Okay, let's move on. So we've said, all right, cool. Deism doesn't match up to the characteristics of this God that we found and noted. So therefore, deism is not a proper explanation. Pantheism. Another worldview represented in religions such as Hinduism and certain forms of Buddhism proposes that God is not a personal being, but rather is synonymous with the universe and its processes. While pantheism's emphasis on unity and oneness may resonate with the profound sense of interconnectedness reported in some NDEs, it falls short of explaining the distinct personal encounters with a loving God that are most frequently described.
And everyone's going to get tired of me saying this, but just remember I do teach religious studies and I teach various world religions. Hinduism has been called sometimes just another name for all the various religions, traditional religions in India. It is
Mm,
very broad.
hmm.
Uh, but often when we're trying to summarize what they believe, people will talk about this impersonal God or whatever, but they tend to have personal gods. And even many Hindus would have an ultimate God personal God that they think they're relating to. So I don't want to put all in a box, but I would say for the Hindus, for example, or Buddhists or others who think of God as someone who's impersonal, this is not going to fit too good with with near death experiences because we see a very personal God here.
Yeah, and to be fair, like I tried not to, because you're right. Like Hinduism turns into this giant tree branch, and polytheism, like that's the next one we're going to address. I do reference Hinduism again because there is
Hmm.
polytheistic branches within it, and so Krishna, which is kind of like the highest in the Hindu faith, is mentioned as a seen figure, but they would say that again they believe this to be Krishna to be essentially synonymous with God, the the top dog in the pantheon. And so if they do mention Krishna, we've often said, Steve, that they're saying it was Krishna, but then there wasn't like this giant host of other gods, right? It was Krishna, and then they describe the characteristics of Krishna, and it's all the characteristics I just gave, for example.
So yes, I would say that within Hinduism, when I look at the near death and deathbed experiences that I've seen, they're typically, if they say something about Krishna, they're not typically talking about uh, the sculptures and pictures that we all. It's not like they saw a picture that looked like that on the
Yeah.
other side. For some Hindus, that's just the highest God. And so they're saying, "Oh, I went to the other side and I saw the highest God." And for them, that might be pretty consistent with seeing a being of light. Okay, so they found God, and we believe in Christianity in general revelation to where people can know that there's a God up there. So I think
Yep.
that's consistent with that. But for those who just believe he's an impersonal force, it just doesn't seem
Yeah,
to
that kind of is out the
drive that
window.
much, or that there are multiple highest gods. It seems like when they go to the other side and see this God that there's one of them. And then when other people describe him, oh, they're all describing the same God.
Hmm.
So I think it's more consistent with one God theism than polytheism that you would see in certain religions.
Right, and that's kind of the next one to be addressed to some degree. I mean, you've already covered most of it, Steve, pretty quickly, which is that
I did
in
a segue.
yeah, you did great for me there. So basically, while these diverse deities might seem to offer, as found in religions like Hinduism and Greek and Roman religions, there's a belief in many gods, each having their domain of influence. While these diverse deities might seem to offer a more personalized spiritual encounter, they fail to match the singular, all-encompassing divine being described in NDEs. And so, again, we're not really seeing this giant sphere of um, these gods and this council and pretty much, I mean, again, if you look at the maps that polytheism paints, Norse mythology, Egyptian mythology, Greek mythology, Roman mythology, you look at these mythologies and you see that these maps are extremely inaccurate once we start looking at this god figure and who he is and how he acts. I mean, if you look at Odin or Thor, or excuse me, not Thor, Odin or Zeus or any of the like top dogs, any of these polytheisms, the characteristics that are associated with him do not match up with these characteristics here.
Mm-mm.
Right. And so that's kind of my point, is that these polytheistic systems start to fall apart when you look at how God is described, and also specifically the experience these people have with God. And there's not these other gods present and part of the journey.
And there are contemporary versions of religions that believe in the old Greek or Roman gods, and so this is not just something of the past. And so I would say that when people go to the other side, they're not seeing this pantheon of gods out there. They're not coming back saying, "Oh, I saw Poseidon, and
Sure.
wow, he told me this and that about the ocean." It's like, okay, if he ever occurs in one, which I've never seen, this is anomalous. This is
Mm-hmm.
not a part of the core experience. And so
Yeah.
I don't see near-death experiences uh, supporting this worldview of the multiple gods.
And not only that, like we're just focusing on G today. Once we get through GLOVE, polytheisms continue to just lose credibility as we progress further down. So we're just focused on one finger right now. And then finally, we're going to focus in on Islam. Okay, so in Islam, a monotheistic religion like Christianity presents a God who is indeed involved in the world, with particular emphasis on his justice. However, the overwhelming divine love and grace reported in NDE seems to align more with Christianity's concept of God, emphasizing God's loving nature, his desire for a personal relationship, and his readiness to forgive. And I've added here into the notes, if you want to see some of Islam's characteristics, you can go to Surahs 357, 61, or chapter 3, verse 57, verse 61. I have a ton listed here. I can even add them into the notes for the episode, where you guys can go see Islam's characterization of Allah and kind of how he views humanity. But some of the verses I've noted, Steve, you gave me a few of these, which discuss how Allah does not love the unbeliever. That's most specifically the one that sticks out in my mind. That seems an incredibly strong characteristic of saying Allah does not love the unbeliever, and yet you have people who go to heaven who experience this unconditional love. And not all, and maybe you would try to make some retro argument from Islam to say, well, he knew that they were going to be a believer, and so now he loves them in the experience, even though they may not have been an Islamic believer afterward. We don't see, at least off of the research I've seen so far, we don't really see a huge conversion to Islamic faith, first of all, after the experience. So then why would Allah love them if they come back and convert to Christianity? And then second of all, the unconditional love that's expressed, that seems incredibly uncharacteristic, because Allah does seem to have conditions associated with this love, namely that you're a believer. So why would he love you in the experience if you weren't a believer? Wouldn't it be more consistent to say, if these were Islamic NDEs, that that Allah would be disappointed with you because you weren't a believer in the experience and would tell you to change your ways or something to that effect? But we don't see that. We don't see, again, we have this kind of God who looks to help you kind of steer you on the right path, but still unconditionally loves you and wants to see the best for you and deeply and personally knows you.
So I would comment on that and say, number one, not all Muslims believe that God is like I see the Quran portraying him. Many Muslims would not believe the Quran very literally when it talks about these things. And so we don't want to paint Muslims, people who believe in the Quran, as all like this. So when you're talking about Muslims themselves, many of them are very loving people. They're taught by the religious leaders over them to be loving toward everyone, whether they believe in
But
Islam or
Steve, if I
not.
could push
But
back
when
on
you
that.
but when you look at the Quran itself,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so here's my copy of the Quran. So what I did was just to go through the Quran and read it devotionally, as if I were a person who believed in the Quran and was putting together my theology of what God is like from the Quran. You can do that if you want to cut through this and do it an easier way. There are topical Qurans online where you can search things like love. Search for love. See what it says about that in the Quran. What you will find is there are references to God. It will often the context you'll find it in is God does not love the person who's not a believer. God does not love the person who's living a sinful life. And in fact, judgment is in store for them. God is against them. And then it encourages people don't befriend these people who have other beliefs, who don't believe in Allah as we do, or who ascribe partners to Allah because Muhammad was living in a time where there were pockets of Jews and pockets of Christians. They would be called people of the book, referring to their belief in the New Testament and Old Testament. And they would say that, they don't love them. In fact, let's see, plead on behalf of the people who deceive themselves. Allah loveth not one who is treacherous and sinful. We can go to uh, lo, lo, those who disbelieve among the people of the scripture and idolaters will abide in the fire of hell. They are worst of created beings. So I would be a person who is a people of the scripture, and I believe that Jesus Christ was actually the Son of God. And so I would be put in this category as the worst of created beings. And it talks about how God does not love these. That's very much contrasted with the Bible, where Jesus was called a friend of sinners. Where in Luke, Jesus uses an analogy about how we ought to love the unlovely and sinners. And he says, for he is kind to ungrateful and evil men, speaking of God. John 3:16, for God so loved the world. So it doesn't mean universalism that everybody's going to go to heaven, but he loves everybody and he wants all to come to repentance. So that to me is very much in contrast with a very literal reading of the Quran. And for those Muslims who believe that way, I think the near death experience presents a different view. And so, if you're taking a near death experience seriously, that a good many of these are actually authentic experiences, it doesn't seem to line up with what I'm reading in the Quran. You read it yourself and see what you think, or look at a topical Quran, study something like love, and see where it takes you.
Yeah, and to be fair, Steve, you'd mentioned kind of some Muslims don't believe that, and we've had this discussion before, and I want to point this out here that I'm critiquing Orthodox Islam. I'm not necessarily going after offshoots of kind of Islam. I want to go and evaluate the Orthodox Islam, much like I want to defend Orthodox Christianity, not necessarily, Protestantism versus, Catholicism or something to that effect. It's more so just looking at the kind of the fundamental roadmaps that are initially laid out by these religious leaders and then kind of what they hand down. So I would say that you could change the interpretations you have of the Islamic scriptures to kind of come up with new interpretations of them. But I would say, I think you can see a notable connection between Islam and especially some kind of the Muslims trying to jive better with the Western world. And so you kind of see this fusion of some Christian concepts and therefore the morphing of their theology versus if you look at Orthodox Islam's like the Taliban and some of these guys they consider themselves the true Muslims, right? They consider themselves the most
Mhm.
orthodox of them all. And so I'm interested in looking at the people who consider themselves the orthodox, the fundamentals, as well as kind of beliefs that Muhammad himself would have held. And I think the Quran can most accurately represent that. And so that perspective, that worldview that's painted by Islam seems to be a very different God than the one we find in NDEs, as well as the God that we find within the Bible.
Well put. I think those distinctions are needed, and I'm glad we've got that moving forward. Again, we're talking about kind of a classic Christianity where people are actually believing the Bible for their theology, which kind of leaves out a very liberal Christianity who just says, well, God spoke to people maybe in New Testament and Old Testament times, and people wrote about it, but we don't really take the words itself that seriously.
Sure.
So some of those views would not jive very well with near-death experiences. We feel like a classic view of the Bible and Christianity does mesh, and a
Mhm.
classic view of the Quran saying we take, seriously exactly what it's saying more literally, that seems to not present the same type of God that we're seeing in a near-death experience.
Well, and also to be fair, there are just some passages both in the Bible and other texts, such as the Quran, that I think are rather straightforward, such as Allah does not love the unbeliever. I think you're to try to position that of like, well, technically, I think you would really have to do some backflips with literature or just with the literature in general to try to get to this point where you could say that you don't believe that that's referencing Allah not loving the unbeliever. I mean, it seems very clear that God would separate out the two, versus in a Christian framework. And for those who needs a little bit of clarity on this, allow me to provide some. Versus a Christian framework, God sends people to hell because of their own choosing. Rebellion against God is a choice we make, and so hell is the destination for continually making that choice. I think repentance is turning away from that and saying, I want to embrace the pardon that God has offered me through Christ and live in accordance with that.
Right, and I mean, we can look at, Surah, 4, verse
81.
107 says, "And plead not on behalf of people who deceive themselves. Lo, Allah loveth not one who is treacherous and sinful." Where the New
Which
Testament
that's
presents a
everybody.
God
That's
who says,
everybody.
well, especially people who don't believe in the one God as the Quran
Sure.
talks about, but ascribes different personalities to God as we would in the Christian faith. One God, three persons, but he doesn't love those. And yet the New Testament talks about for God so loved the world. So again, it just seems to me that the New Testament picture of God presents itself very clearly in the Christian faith and is very consistent.
So, okay. So my final note is this: in contrast to these worldviews that we've mentioned, which is deism, pantheism, polytheism, and Islam. In contrast to these worldviews, the Christian perspective is uniquely coherent with the characteristics of the divine figure presented in these NDE accounts. The God of Christianity is a personal, loving deity involved in human affairs who offers grace and guidance and is both transcendent and immanent. The transformative nature of NDE is marked by encounters with this divine figure and often lead to lasting changes in attitude and values, and it aligns seamlessly with the Christian understanding of being born again or profoundly transformed by an encounter with God.
Very well put.
And
And may I mention how much I just applaud you for trying to look. See, some people are going to look at us and say, oh, you're just trying to fit the near death experience research into Christianity. Well, it seems to me for much too long, researchers have put all these things in very vague terms. In fact, when they'll talk about how many times God is mentioned in near death experiences, they'll put him in a category of a person has seen other sentient beings or religious beings. They put it in very vague terms. I believe that a part of the reason for this is that these are not Christian pastors or people teaching at Christian seminaries that are doing these studies. These are people in secular universities who are trying to be fair to everyone and put things in terms that don't sound exclusive. There's a very strong peer pressure in academia not to be exclusive, but be as open as possible to all views. And I appreciate that. I'm in academia. I understand those pressures. But at some point, you have to say, okay, what what are we talking about here in the near death experience? And it sounds kind of like an Alcoholics Anonymous group where people are supposed to say higher power and to refrain from saying anything specific about God or Jesus
Yeah.
because we don't want to offend anybody else. We want to be inclusive in our Alcoholics Anonymous group. So we limit ourselves to saying, okay, there's a higher power up there. But then inevitably it starts coming out. People say, yeah, well, I need to pray more to God,
Yeah. Which
and they're
God?
really talking about
Yeah.
a personal God who loves them and that they can depend on. So it seems to me
Well,
that when you talk about a being of light, uh, the great majority of people feel like this is God, and we'll call him a being of light. In near death studies, they'll call him a higher power in AA. But when it gets down to it, what are we talking about? This is an extremely smart, personal, loving being. Hey, this is this is what in biblical studies we called God.
mm-hmm.
So let's say, what are we talking about up there? Are we talking about, okay, I went to the other side and I saw this being? Are we talking about Carl from accounting department, who died a few weeks ago? Is that who we're seeing? Well, no, because this guy, what I saw, knew all these things and was more loving than Carl was. B, are we talking about a flying spaghetti monster? As Richard Dawkins talks about? No. Are we talking about an impersonal force? No. Okay, well, it must be God we're talking about. I think that's pretty obvious to us, but I understand the academic pressure to just call it a being of light and leave it at that because we don't want to be mean to anyone. Any comments on that? But I'm just applauding you for saying at some point you got to say, okay, this is God we're talking about. This is the way traditionally we've defined God in theism.
Yeah. I do have some thoughts on that. And first, I want to just say that to agree with Steve, it's like all of these studies are going to say proof of the afterlife, proof of the afterlife, proof of the afterlife. And let's just think about this for a moment. I want to draw a parallel to help people kind of understand. I think we live in a world where the anticipation is that there should be an afterlife. Now, we take that for granted, okay? And what do I mean by that? If I came to you and I said, I have proof that aliens exist, okay? Wouldn't the natural next question after we've established, okay, he has really good evidence that aliens exist, wouldn't the the next natural question be, who are they? What do they want? What do they like? What do they want? You would want to start knowing these characteristics about aliens existing, because it's like everybody wants to talk about if aliens exist, if they don't exist, yada yada yada. But let's be honest. If we were like, if I came to you tomorrow and I said I have 100% evidence that aliens exist, here you go, and I was able to prove this on the world stage, and everybody's like, this is good evidence. This is really good evidence that aliens exist. The next immediate question is, okay, now what do the aliens want? And so we start looking at the characteristics, because we understand that there are consequences to the brute fact of aliens exist, just like there are consequences to the brute fact that afterlife is a real thing and it exists. And so the question then becomes, okay, what are those consequences? Who's enforcing those consequences? How do we get this right? Like, what are the implications of the afterlife existing? And I just think maybe it's like we live in this Western world that kind of secretly understands that an afterlife is there. And so when we bring that up and we go, don't you believe in an afterlife? It's like, yeah, I do. But person A's version of the afterlife is vastly different from person B's version of the afterlife. And it's like, there are consequences to these decisions, no matter what. If Islam is true, there's consequences to have right and wrong worldviews. If Christianity is true, there are consequences to having right and wrong views about it. And so I think it seems a little inconsistent for me personally to come to the conclusion and be like, guys, the afterlife exists, and then kind of just let the buck stop there. I think that is a lot of peer pressure from modernity kind of going into the academia and being like, all you get to say is that the afterlife exists, but you can't go past that point. And I feel like that's just getting started, like telling people you're going to get pushed out of the airplane, but in terms of what parachute you should put on, I'm going to leave that up to you to decide.
Very good analogy. Very good.
And so that's why we do this, is because I want people to understand that there's a lot of great evidence out there for the Christian worldview. And notably, maybe you said, well, Charlie, you didn't talk about Judeo worldview. And that's because I would see that as synonymous with Christianity. I mean, Christianity thinks that Jesus is the continuation of what we find in the Old Testament. And so therefore, Judeo-Christian worldview is kind of essentially the same, in my opinion. There are other matters that we can talk about to kind of get specifically to the heart of the matter, which is, Jesus rising from the dead specifically, to kind of be a big separator between the two. But if you're willing to permit that the afterlife exists and that Christianity is most accurately reflecting it, then there's no reason to think that Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, based off of this, because we've established
Right.
miraculous.
As we've talked about earlier, you do need to deal with the 17 to 20% of near-death experiences. From my finding and looking at consecutive experiences on the NDERF site of sightings of Jesus on the other side, which if it's 17 to 20% and I'm right on that, then that makes that a part of the core experience as well and feeds into the Christian view of the deity of Christ. And we probably won't even go that direction. We've gone that direction in the past.
Yeah.
But again, these are things that, and I think a lot of the prejudice in our society about going further into this with Jesus and with God and a personal God is that there have been so many misrepresentations of what the Bible teaches and what Christianity ought to be, and the mixing of religion with politics, so that when we start talking about these things, some people just think, "Oh my goodness, that's the last place I want to go, because then I'm going to have to be a follower of Trump, or I'm going to have to be a follower of this or that." And they
Sure.
mix it all together, where I think some believers have become pawns of a certain political faction, and it becomes identified, and we don't want to be identified with any one political faction. As Christianity, I think we need to, sure, you vote personally and do that, but we don't want to identify with Christianity with some type of ultra conservative agenda, which turns a lot of people off. And so I think the big problem with bringing Jesus and Christianity and the Bible and a personal God into it is often a lot of misconceptions people have of what core Christianity is all about.
Mm.
So,
All right. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. So thank you so much for your guys' time today. That covers G, God focused. Next week, we'll be talking more about love, which is the L, overwhelming love in these experiences, and going a little bit deeper on that one. Actually, it's not next week. Sorry. It's the next episode that'll happen the week after. So if you disagree, if you think we got something wrong, please comment below. Comment below. We would love to dedicate an episode to kind of engaging with questions and pushback, and kind of expanding and defending the position, because it helps us get better at it too. So if you disagree, comment below. If you agree, comment below. If you found it helpful, send it to someone. If you think somebody else would be interested in it, send it to them. That's the best way to help us out. It's just simply send it to someone you think would find value in it. In the meantime, God bless. We'll see you guys in the next one.